Our first reading tonight is from Exodus chapter 40, various verses. And it may seem to be a bit of an odd text for Advent, but hopefully we'll get there. So the tabernacle was set up for the first day of the first month in the second year. When Moses set up the tabernacle, he put bases in place and erected the frames and inserted the crossbars and set up the posts. And then he spread the tent over the tabernacle and put the covering over the tent as the Lord had commanded him. He took the testimony and placed it in the ark, attached the poles to the ark, and put the atonement cover on it. Then he brought the ark into the tabernacle and hung the shielding curtain and shielded the ark of the testimony as the Lord commanded him. Then the cloud covered the tent of the meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of the meeting because the cloud had settled upon it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. In all the travels of the Israelites, whenever the cloud lifted from above the tabernacle, they would set out. But if the cloud did not lift, they would not set out until the day that it lifted. So the cloud of the Lord was over the tabernacle by day, and the fire was in the cloud by night, and in the sight of all the house of Israel during all their travels. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Please stand for the reading of the Holy Gospel. The Gospel according to St. John, chapter 1, verses 14 through 18. The Word became flesh and made its dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. John testified concerning him. He cried out, saying, "This was he of whom I said, 'He who comes after me has surpassed me, because he was before me.' From the fullness of his grace, we all have received one blessing after another. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, but God, the one and only, who is at the Father's side, made him known." This is the gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. Please be seated. When Karen and I were first wed, the first several years for our anniversary, we would go tent camping. It's not necessarily because we liked living on rocks, but it was cheap and we could afford it, and we liked being outside, and so it was awesome. But one of the big things that always was kind of a point of learning and a point of debate was, where are we going to pitch the tent, all right? And so there were different criteria. Sometimes if you were in a beautiful place where there was a lake or a river nearby, you would want to have the view. But sometimes the view would be in such a place that, like, I remember one time we made this mistake. The view was beautiful, but when it rained, we were at the bottom of a hill and we got flooded out. Maybe you can relate. Sounds like some of you can. Or maybe there was a really good view, but the land was just filled with rocks, and you said, okay, just because the view is so awesome, we're gonna stay there anyway. But there's a lot of criteria that go into where you pitch your tent, where you set up your dwelling. That was something that we learned by trial and error. There was no divine intervention in our tabernacling. I'll say it that way. The Israelites, on the other hand, had it pretty good. They had, if you remember the story, as a matter of fact, last week, Pastor Steve kind of shared with us how Jesus himself actually had appeared in the burning bush and was leading the people of God up out of Egypt. Many times in the Old Testament, when it says the Lord appeared, it was actually kind of, if we look at John's text from today, it said this, "No one has ever seen God, but God, the one and only, who is at the Father's side, made him known." In other words, what he's saying is those things were Jesus. Jesus, pre-incarnate, was actually there in the burning bush. Jesus, pre-incarnate, was actually there in the tabernacle. His presence was known in the Old Testament. And it was him who was actually leading the people. Now, that's a fascinating thing. So this was what happened here in Exodus chapter 40. Well, back in Exodus, you remember chapters like 12 and 13, they go through the Red Sea. And what's leading them? Fire cloud, right? Through the waters and out into the desert and out of Egypt, Jesus was leading them. The pre-incarnate second person of the Godhead was there, leading them. And as he goes along, here in chapter 40, they've been given specific instructions about what this tent of the meeting should include. It should have in it, and the version of the text that we read had some terms that I'm not as familiar with. It talked about the testimony. Well, that's really the two tablets that Moses had. Some translations, the translation we used here tonight said the testimony. In another place it says the atonement cover. That's actually the mercy seat. Most of you would be more familiar with that language of the tablets and the mercy seat. But in this tabernacle, there was very specific layout. There was like an incense and a table, and there was curtains, and all of this. God had given specific instructions to Moses about how this layout was supposed to appear. And so Moses goes and he does these things. But when he gets it all in place, it says here in chapter 40 that it was so holy, that the presence of God was so thick there, that Moses wasn't even allowed to go into the tent of the meeting. He wasn't allowed to go into the tabernacle. He wasn't allowed to go into the dwelling place where the very Spirit of Jesus was living, because it was too powerful. It was too much. It would have killed him. And so instead, God does this. He actually tells the Israelites where you're going to go. See, when the cloud would lift off of the tent of the meeting and would move up, it would kind of drift over this way, and the people would go, they would follow under the cloud that had lifted off of the meeting place of God. And then it would settle back down, and they would stay there for a while. And it was their guiding star, the very presence of God guiding them. It was a beautiful thing. When I would go tent camping, I wished for that kind of divine intervention. We would have had pleasant sleeps and things like that. But this mobile temple, this place that contained the most holy of Israel's symbols, it contained the 10 Commandments. It contained the mercy seat. If you remember the mercy seat was where annually the high priest would come in and he would sprinkle blood on the mercy seat, and then he would throw blood on the people. And that was how you became clean. It seems weird to our minds that you would become clean by blood. But it's a very symbolic way of saying blood is going to need to be cleansing you. This was a forerunner to Jesus. It was a way of God showing us how ultimately this was going to go. There was blood, and there was blood, and more blood. And for many, 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 many decades and even centuries, this went on until one appeared, one whose advent we now sing about. See, this text is not all that weird for an Advent thing when you realize that it was the presence of Jesus then, 1,500 years before his incarnate presence, and we're now 2,000 years past that, and guess what? He's here. He is tabernacling. He is making his dwelling. He is pitching his tent right here in each of us. That's what it says. By faith, when a person comes into faith, what happens is Jesus takes up residence, even as he was in the tent of the meeting, even as he was in the burning bush, even as he was when he became incarnate as the Son of Man 2,000 years ago, and now by the power of his Spirit indwells us. Same Jesus, same guy. And we celebrate his coming among us. It's an interesting thing. John even picked up on this when John wrote, "The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us." That word dwelling is actually the same root word as tabernacle. The Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. He is dwelling in this room here today. And not because of this holy place. No, because you, his people, are holy. Yeah, it's nice to have a place to gather. I actually mentioned this in Bible class on Sunday, but there's a church in Fort Worth just off of Hewlin and I-20, and its name is the Meeting Place of the Church of Fort Worth. A lot of words, a little bit too much for me. I prefer Grace Lutheran, but here's the point they're trying to make, is that the church is not a building. The church is the physical building is just the meeting place. The church is the people. That's good theology. I like what they're trying to do there. That communicates to me the advent of Christ in his people. We are thankful for these spaces, but we're more thankful for this space that Jesus has carved out. This is where the action happens. These spaces where we come together and celebrate are awesome, and we need them because we need the encouragement of the brethren. It's important that we get together. But it's also true that you can go through a place like this over and over again and miss it. I don't want anybody to miss it. Tonight, he's saying to you, I want to dwell in you. I want to make my dwelling place. I want to pitch my tent in you. Going to church is one thing. It's wonderful. But having this place where you know in your heart of hearts he is dwelling, that's huge. You know, we have used this illustration a lot, and I apologize. Sometimes I feel like I become a one-trick pony, but I need to say this. When Christ crossed that canyon and he became flesh and dwelt among us, he bridged the gap back to God. There was no way back to God through the ritual bloodletting that happened annually. No permanent way back to God. Every year, people had to make sacrifices, and they just hoped that it was enough. But we have one who has fully bridged the gap. And I've used this illustration a lot, where we're over here, and our sin puts this huge dividing wall between us and God. And here's a holy God who can't accept anything but perfection. And Jesus bridged that gap between us and the Father. He became incarnate and bridged that gap. And I've said this many times, but I hope this sinks in tonight again. I used to think that the more I did Bible study and the more I went to church and the more I was in small groups and the more I prayed, that the gap would shrink. That's not how it works. That's actually, I think, a lie from the heart of Satan. The more I know about me, I'm somewhere up there in Ellis County or whatever direction that might be, and God's perfection is way down there on the coast, and I have no hope. It is not shrinking. The more I know about myself, the more I know the gap between me and God is more than I could ever span. And instead of me thinking I'm more holy, what I actually see is my own brokenness more and more. And that's a gift. It's a gift to experience your own brokenness, because the humiliation of Christ on the cross allows me to be humbled and not feel like I have to prove myself to God by my good works. My self-justifying behavior never works. I need one who could justify me, one who lived a perfect life, one who could bridge this gap, a gap too far that I could never go. His name is Jesus. He wants to tabernacle in you and me here tonight. There's a couple of ways that I think you can really stay dialed into this. And I know they probably seem to get a little familiar and therefore maybe lose a little bit of the oomph. But here's what I want to say. You need to be, in order for that to happen, in order for Jesus to fully tabernacle in you, to fully take up his residence in you, there's a couple things that you need to do. You need to be in a place where the gospel is clear. And as we've said here a lot of times, the gospel is kind of a two-part message, right? It's, I'm more sinful than I want to admit, but I'm 1,000 times more loved than I could dare to dream. You need to hear that message over and over and over. It just needs to become a part of who you are. You need to be in a place to dwell, to tabernacle, to pitch your tent in a place where you hear the gospel regularly. And you also need to be in a place where the holy presence of God, the sacred elements of God are coming into you. The sacraments are distributed in such a way that they impact your life. I know a lot of people who can just walk through a communion line and not experience the tabernacling of God in that moment. Don't let that be you. Appreciate the gift. He died for you. He made you right now and forever. He's rebooting your life every time you take that gift that he gives you. Tonight, my prayer is this, that the presence, the tabernacling presence, the dwelling presence of Jesus would continue to increase and overflow. As we overflow, the advent, the coming of our God just kind of oozes out of us. And it's exciting to the people who are around and watching. They say, I want some of that. What do you have that I need? The presence of God. I'm going to ask you to pray with me. Father in heaven, what we're seeking here tonight is your huge presence. Presence beyond what we can muster up and imagine and dream about. But it's the presence who would lead the people of God through the desert for 40 years. It's the presence who would speak in a burning bush. It's the presence who would cry out on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? So that we would not be forsaken. Thank you for grace and mercy that come to us again through your word. May the gospel never lose its oomph. May we not take for granted the message that Jesus is for us. May we continue to put ourselves in places where the gospel takes root. We ask it for the sake of him who died. And all of God's people said, amen.